Hi, I'm Harry from Biofeedback Resources International, and I am going to share with you a short presentation on Brain Mapping 101. Let me get started here. Okay, really, this is just intended to introduce the concept of brain mapping, not a detailed training on it at all. So, brain mapping is also sometimes referred to as QEEG, or quantitative electroencephalography. It's a method of recording electrical activity from the scalp, and that tends to use 12 to 32 or maybe even more electrodes or sensors at one time. The more common method is using a 19-channel cap. You can see this is a drawing of a cap that's used, and I'll show you what a real one looks like. This is one of the devices that we use. This is the BrainMaster Discovery 24. It's a 24-channel EEG device. This is the cap that's used, and this is a syringe that has a blunt needle, so it's a needle that's not sharp on the end, and we use that to squirt gel into each of these electrodes or sensors that are in the cap, and that causes the connection to be improved between the scalp and the electrode, so we can pick up the EEG signal. Just back up here for a second. So this cap is then connected by a flat ribbon cable that plugs into the front of the instrument. Okay, so this is a raw EEG recording, and we have a line here for each one of the sensors or electrodes on the cap is connected to one of these lines. So you have a line for each one, so you can see what the activity is from each of the sensors on the head. That information is then fed into software that will then get additional information from each one of those, so it can break up the raw signal that you're seeing here into each of the different frequencies, going from delta all the way up to gamma and so on. There are norms that are put into a database, and it looks at measures like amplitude and coherence and so on for each one of those sites for different age groups and so on, so that it can determine how close or how far away the information is from the person that you recorded from as compared to the database. And the database would have been recordings of many people's brains at different ages and gender and so on, so that it comes up with what the normal range is for that activity for a person. And now when we do a recording, we can compare to that to see if the person is in normal range, that's plus or minus one standard deviation, or if it's low or high by 2 or 3 standard deviations from the average. Okay, so these are the measures that we look at. You have absolute power, relative power, you have power ratios, amplitude asymmetry, coherence, and phase. These are all different things that are part of the database that the brain activity sample that we record is compared to. And this is just an example of a display where it's using these different colors to indicate whether an area is within normal range or if it is deviating from what would be considered normal. And these are other views of that activity. This is not what we usually use for recording a brain map, but this is showing individual electrodes, and there's a lot more than 19 here. And that's another method of recording. This is another sample of a display that's showing the green being considered within the normal range, and then the blue would be lower than normal, red would be higher than normal. So there are three primary uses of the normative databases. One would be to assess the neurological status of a patient and to determine to what extent there's a neurological basis of the patient's complaint. So in other words, if someone has anxiety, if we look at their brain activity and compare it to the database, are there areas that would be associated with anxiety where their activity is higher or lower than the norm? And that would say, okay, then in this situation, there is data that would say that there's brain activity that's associated with the problem. And so neurofeedback would make more sense in a case like that to be part of the therapy to help the person with that symptom. If we did a recording and there's no place where there's a deviation from the norm that would be related to anxiety, then we would maybe have to look elsewhere in terms of what might be a good therapy to help them. And then the second is to identify possible strengths and weaknesses in the organization of electrophysiological status of the patient's brain so as to aid in the efficient and optimal design of neurotherapy. So we would look at where there are issues where the activity is higher or lower than the norm, and then we would set up our protocol in a way to address that. Third would be to increase efficiency and to objectively evaluate the efficacy of treatment by comparing the patient's EEG before, during, and after the treatment. So we have a baseline, we do our treatment, we can do another recording and see if the activity changed and if it's closer to the norm after training. So we want to look at the demographics and gender criteria. The term normative, when it's used alone, tends to obscure or mask the fundamental fact that only a sample of subjects drawn from a much larger population are contained in any database. Mathematically, the practical utility of a database is measured only to the extent that the database constitutes a representative sample of the general population of neurologically and clinically normal individuals. So the database and how it was constructed could be very important. You want to make sure that it is representative of the population that you're working with. And if it's not very representative of that population, then we have to take that into consideration and when we're using the database. And we can still use it as a guide, but it may not be as accurate as we would hope if it's not representative of the population. So that affects the concept of normalcy and demographic representation. It's crucial to the creation of a reference EEG database of normal individuals. So you have things like ethnic and cultural backgrounds, diversity can be important to include there. This is an example of a graphical part of a brain map report. And so here it's showing, and you always have to look at the legend here. So the middle color there is green, and then going to the left it's blue, going to the right it's red. So any of these areas that's mostly green, you would say those are considered to be within normal range. When you see these blues, that means they're lower than normal. When you see the reds, they're higher than normal. Yellows and oranges are also higher than normal. So that's how you get an idea of what this means. And so this particular example would be dealing with someone who had attention problems, and it's showing that these frequencies, 11 and 12 hertz, that are within the alpha range are higher than normal. Alpha is a relaxed state, or it's a brainwave that is associated with relaxation. And if you're too relaxed while you're trying to focus, then that can be a problem. So this would be indicating that maybe this person has too much alpha for times when they're doing a task. And so the goal might be to train that alpha down to decrease it. Okay. Yeah, so that is just a quick introduction, and this is contact information here. We do trainings in biofeedback and neurofeedback. This much more detail would be included in our neurofeedback training. If you want more information, you can contact us here by phone, by email. You can also check out our website and get more information there. We offer training programs several times a year. The schedule of training is on the website, biofeedbackinternational.com. You can also call our office, and we'd be happy to give you more information. And that way you can get all the detail of the brain mapping as well as the neurofeedback that would follow once you do the initial brain map assessment. All right, so I will stop sharing here. And thanks for listening. And again, if you want more information, please feel free to contact us. Thanks.